All right. Today is March the 4th in 2023, and my guest is Alex Tabarrok. Alex is a professor of economics at George Mason University and a research fellow with the Mercatus Center. Alex is one of the world's best teachers of economics, with a very large spread as the co-founder of Marginal Revolution University, the popular Marginal Revolution blog, together with Tyler Cowen. I've learned a lot from Alex over the years, and I'm very excited to have him on the show today. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks, Nicholas. Great to be here.
Today, I want to talk a bit about some principles of economics that explain a lot, including the Baumol effect and how it explains why the prices are so damn high, especially right now. Especially, it seems like even more so, right? And then use this as a segue to talk about your work on institutions such as private cities and lessons for entrepreneurs, how to unleash innovation. If we get to it, I'd also love to hear about dominant assurance contracts and how we can implement them in startup jurisdictions. Alex, to start with, a quote from John Maynard Keynes. Practical men believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence, are usually the slaves of some defunct economists. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler a few years back. My question is, does economics do more good than harm? And how do we know?
Yeah. Well, good economics does more good than harm. You know, uh, Consistent with the Keynes quote, Paul Samuelson once said, "I don't care who writes the nation's laws, so long as I get to write the nation's textbooks." And the job of Tyler and I is to remove Samuelson, okay, from the leading textbooks and replace it with our book, Modern Principles. And we're trying to do that with the textbook, with Marginal Revolution, with Marginal Revolution University, teach good economic principles all around the world.
Great. What are your top three, and you can do five if you want, economic insights or principles?
Yeah. Okay. So, I guess one of the ones you alluded to at the beginning was sort of the cause of inflation, right? This is a topic which comes up again and again and again. And I think Milton Friedman basically had it correct, which was that inflation always and everywhere is a monetary phenomenon. We have to look to inflation in the stock of money to explain inflation in the stock of prices. Now, it can be complicated because not all monetary phenomena are inflationary, right? And especially, when you have low inflation, there are other things which can matter as well, supply shocks, things like that. But it's a really important principle to understand that if your country is undergoing, inflation rates of, you know, 10% per year, let alone 100% per year, or 1,000 or 10,000, which is not impossible by any means whatsoever. You have to look to the central bank. It's their fault. They're printing too much money. That is the answer to that. So that's number one. What is the cause of inflation? I guess kind of another classic answer would be, trade-offs, right? Um, which means you just can't have everything. And like one of the things I've talked a lot about in my work, but also in sort of the textbook as an example of this, is do we want our drugs, to be perfectly safe? And at first you think, well, of course, who wouldn't want safe drugs, right? But there's a cost to that. There's a cost to making the drug safer, and that is that the trials, the clinical trials, then have to be bigger. They have to be longer. If you want to find every possible side effect, then you need huge, expensive clinical trials to do that. And that means you're going to get fewer new drugs. And if you have fewer new drugs, then more people are going to die. So actually, more safety can kill people, right? And that's a lesson which I think is hard for people to really grasp. I say that when the FDA, fails to when they approve a bad drug, and there are problems, everybody knows about it, right? And heads roll at the FDA, and people die, and that's known, and it's in the newspapers. But when the FDA fails to approve a good drug, when they take a long time to approve a good drug, or when they raise costs so much that the good drug is never even researched and developed, so it doesn't even exist. Well, the people who would have lived had that drug been available, they die, but they are buried in an invisible graveyard. And I say, economists, we're used to kind of seeing the invisible hand. So economists are pretty good at seeing the invisible graveyard and trying to point that out to people. So this is a application of the of trade-offs. Those are two good ones. I don't know. I suppose I could come up with more, but that two is pretty good.
Yeah, I love those principles. It's also a bit sort of the seen and the unseen, right? When it comes to the
Right.
invisible
Absolutely.
graveyard and the FDA, that's a powerful concept, right? So there's things that you see happen if you go a certain course, a certain policy, but you don't see what doesn't happen if you had taken another course.
Exactly. Yeah, we see that with international trade is another classic example of that, right? So when you have more trade, the competitors, the domestic competitors to the imports, they lose business, and people see that they lose their jobs, and factories close and things like that. But what you don't see is the exporters who may be in other parts of the country, but because other countries are selling us more goods, they're also buying more from us. They actually want more of our goods and services. So you generate a lot more exports. When you import more, you also export more. And that's again something which, exactly as you said, is hard to see.
Yeah, yeah. I would have started my number one with non-zero sum exchange,
Ah, yes,
because for economists, that's just so clear after you've learned
yes,
it. But for non-economists, that's sometimes like, right? So when two people trade, they don't trade if they don't get more utility from the trade that they had before. So that overall increases utility if they trade, right?
yeah, no,
So
absolutely.
yeah,
So
so that's,
the importance of growth as another sort of version of that, which I think people don't really conceptualize that well, right? So if you're growing at 2% per year, you're doubling every 35 years. If you're going at 1%, you're only doubling every 70 years. So that's a huge difference over time. So this focusing on growth, positive sum games, making a bigger pie. A lot of people are focused on splitting the pie up, and economists tend to focus more on growing the pie, which is the only way that everyone can become rich.
yeah, yeah. The other ones would have been like comparative advantage and opportunity costs, but that's also kind of a part of trade-offs, right? It's just
Sure,
like taking
sure.
it a bit further, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
if you specialize on one thing that you're relatively better at than someone else, it takes a bit of, you have to show people the formula maybe. But hey, if somebody else, even if you're better in everything than someone else, they can still do valuable work by doing something that you're relatively worse at than the other thing. It's, again, once you learn it, it's just so clear and you understand so much more about the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that marginal utility, that's a bit more complex, but also very important. Dynamic equilibrium, creative destruction would be one of my favorites.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I learned a lot from you. Yeah, I'd like to later go a bit about the creative destruction part, because that's kind of
Hmm.
a bit of core to my thinking and probably also my biases,
Yeah,
which is why I want to put some challenges to your Baumol paper later.
sure.
But one question before, why is it that economics is so unintuitive to people in a way that people are not like agnostic as to what they believe? They have very strong confidence in false beliefs.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think you got at it earlier when you mentioned, these positive sum games, and talking about economic growth, because those things are actually uh, very recent, right? Through most of humanity's history, we're living in small tribes, and we're living close to Malthusian situations. When, yeah, actually, kind of, most games are zero sum, right? Uh, some people, how do you get rich? In a situation like, well, you steal, right? Either you become, a great man, and Alexander the Great or whatever, and you invade armies, and that's how you gather land and slaves, and you steal resources. That was most of human history, right? Is the only way you could get rich was really through mass theft, war, and theft, and so forth. Um, and that's also true about the small tribe. Of course, there are some positive games within a small tribe as well, but there's not a lot of room for growth. And people lived in the same uh, evolutionary stable equilibrium for thousands of generations with basically nothing happening, right? No improvement in welfare and no improvement or really no change in technology, you know. Only with the coming of the Industrial Revolution do we really see this discontinuous change, the hockey stick of economic growth. And so the principles which give rise to the Industrial Revolution, focusing on growth and positive sum and technology, these are not natural to us. And I think the idea of trading with strangers, again, globalization, although people have always done it, um, again, we have this from our tribal heritage, fear of strangers, right? And the other, and that the strangers bring disease and they're not to be trusted. And, so the idea that we are trading with people all over the world, again, is a very foreign concept. There's Dunbar's number, right? We can handle about 200 in our sort of a group in our heads. And yet in the modern world, we have to cooperate with millions of people. Again, you mentioned specialization, right? So in previous eras, there really was no such thing as specialization, not as we would understand it today. Everybody in the tribe pretty much had to be able to do any of the jobs in the tribe. Maybe they're not as good at it as, somebody, but, and so forth. But in a modern era, we have, you know, specialists in the ear, we have specialists in the nose, eye specialists, optometrists, right? So podiatrist is a specialist in the foot. Oh my God. Right. So if I have a foot problem, I go to the guy who specializes in treating feet. I mean, that's kind of crazy, right? So the amount of specialization which has occurred, and how can you specialize? Well, how can a guy who only treats feet, how can he survive? Well, he has to trade for almost everything, right? Almost everything. The podiatrist, doesn't know how to make any of the food or the goods or the services which he consumes. And yet a podiatrist, of course, is able to live a very good lifestyle, but only because they trade with millions of other people. But that's very strange. That's very strange to think that someone would make their living by having this extreme knowledge of the foot. what a strange thing. So I think the answer to your question is that we have what Hayek you always use this term, which I like, these atavistic preferences, these preferences and beliefs which were appropriate for this evolutionary stable equilibria, but which really don't fit with the modern industrial revolution.
Yeah, and now what always fascinates me is when I think I read somewhere about Smith, I could be wrong about that, that he was the first one to saw kind of things like division of labor and had sort of the cornerstones of dynamic equilibrium in his thinking and of how it could all sort of work together and sort of the invisible hand. But he was thinking or looking at sort of a more agrarian economy with sort of a nascent industrial revolution. And he thought sort of getting this right, sort of getting free trade, relatively free markets and sort of limited government would lead to like a 3 to 4x growth, right? So
Right,
even Adam
right.
Smith underestimated the effect of compounding growth, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think, yeah, at the time Smith wrote, 1776 was the publication of The Wealth of Nations. Um, Even the most advanced thinkers could not predict the Industrial Revolution. It was beginning, you kind of saw, but to understand what was coming, the railroad and the telegraph and all that kind of stuff, it really took, until the science fiction authors, I think until Julius Verne, people like that, to really begin to understand what was going on around them. Oddly enough, I think we're living in a similar time today with the breakthroughs in artificial intelligence. I don't think anyone today can actually predict what's going to happen in the future. The span of uncertainty has actually just grown so much. But I think we are in an industrial revolution of thinking.
Yeah, true. Just to hold that thought that it's amazing how far we've grown just through compounding growth, right? So nobody was ever able to really see. If you ask someone in 1950, they would be amazed at what we have today, or at 1900 and 1950. right? So, um, and we got it through that process of positive sum exchange and relatively free markets and trade, right? So these are kind of the key ingredients to unleash kind of entrepreneurship. Um, so why is it that we see all these advances in technology and artificial intelligence and the world of bits and computers, but why are housing prices rising? Why is education getting so expensive without really getting better? And why is, what explains that prices get so high and just these sectors that seem to be stagnating versus others that seem to be progressing so rapidly? What explains that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's two sort of issues here. Is one, why do some sectors advance in productivity more quickly than others? And part of that is sort of, randomness. You get a breakthrough in one area and that leads to a rapid increase. So we get a breakthrough with the steam engine, and that the idea that that is possible then leads to a rapid set of advances. Or the Wright brothers, right? They show, oh, flight is possible, and then you get this rapid set of advances. So you go from the Wright brothers in, I don't know, was 1912, 1911, something like that. I remember something like that. And by the 1940s, 1950s, we have jets, right? And then by the 1970s, 1969, where we're on the moon. So you have these breakthroughs and there's a rapid set of advances, which then, sort of peter out, right? So we haven't made a number of huge advances in aircraft since, the jet. So part of that, and like housing, we haven't seen huge productivity advances, and there may also be regulatory problems. And in housing especially, okay, the big issue there is not building the house, it's the land. And so the big issue has become, we have just stopped allowing people to build. San Francisco prices are sky high, but the apartment buildings are not sky high. Usually when the price of land goes up, the height of buildings goes up, right? But that has not happened. Where it's almost impossible to build things in, the San Francisco Bay area. I was talking with my son, Maxwell Tabarrok, who's also interested in these issues, and he was pointing out we used to do a lot of land reclamation, right? So something like, 50% of Boston today, didn't exist 100 years ago. It's been reclaimed from the ocean and so forth. We don't do that anymore, right? Land reclamation, like actually building more land, that was a thing which we used to do, Chicago, there's the Chicago River, and in the 1900s, they actually reversed the direction of the river. Okay, right? So it's like unbelievable, right? And we just don't do that. Imagine trying to, reverse the direction of a river today. It would be, uproar. It wouldn't happen, right? So there are all these. So some of it is random. Some of it is regulation that we have imposed upon ourselves. And then there's the third category, which gets into the Baumol effect. And that is that in some areas, for, for a variety of reasons, it's just really, really, really hard to increase productivity in those areas. And often this involves things with a lot of labor, human to human kind of a labor. Like a classic example, from Baumol, maybe we'll come back to this, is, the concerto, right? Requires four people, quartet, and it requires them, 40 minutes to play this piece. And it required 40 minutes when the piece was written in 1820. And it requires four people, 40 minutes to produce the same piece, today in 2023. Services, right? Like to give someone a massage, right? You could have gotten a great massage in Rome, in Roman era, Rome, right? A 1 BC. If you wanted a massage, you could have had a fantastic massage in the Roman baths. It's no better today, right? And it's no more, you can't get a good massage in less time, right? There's been no productivity improvement in massages, maybe you can go to those chairs you see in the airport, right? Which really are not as good, right? They're just not as good, but you put your quarters in. But they're frankly not as good as having another human being give you a massage. So no improvement in the productivity of massages in over 2,000 years, right? That's kind of crazy, right? So there are goods like that, often involving services, where the productivity doesn't improve. And because of that, it's inevitable that the relative price of those services goes up. And we can talk more about that, but that's the essence of it.
Sure. So why do the relative prices go up?
Okay, so think about the masseuse, okay, in Rome in 1 BC, right? What else is the masseuse going to do? Like they don't have the opportunity cost is actually quite low. Wages are very low, right? So the masseuse can go be subsistence farmer, or they can do something else of low productivity, right? So it's cheap. It's cheap to get a massage, okay? Because to get the massage, you have to pull labor from other sectors of the economy, right? But if those other sectors aren't very productive, then to pull labor into the massage sector is quite easy. It's cheap because because there's lots of labor available. They're not being paid a lot. Now think about today. If we want to have a massage, Swedish massage or something like that, we got to pull somebody from manufacturing, from teaching, from education, from all these other sectors where they're paid quite a bit. Okay. So it is much more expensive. The relative price of massage has gone up, which is a reflection of the fact that productivity in other sectors has gone way up. So if we want more massages today, we have to give up a lot more, right? In Roman era BC, 1 BC, you're not giving up a lot by getting more massages because those people were just basically producing enough to feed themselves. So you don't have to give up a lot. But to get a massage today, you have to pull somebody pretty educated, pretty capable. You got to pull them from the manufacturing sector. You have to pull them from another sector of the economy where they're capable of producing a lot. And so the relative price has gone up because to get a massage, we now must give up much, much more other goods. And what relative prices do is they represent that trade-off. So the price is just a number. It's just a figure which represents how much other goods must we give up to get this good. And so we have to give up a lot of other goods to get a massage. So the more productive the other sectors become, the higher the price of the low productivity sectors is. So this is sometimes a lot of people make this mistake. They think that, okay, we want to explain, like, why is it so expensive? Healthcare. Why is education so expensive? Why are massages so expensive? Why is it so much more expensive to repair goods than it used to be? Okay. And they think, okay, well, we have to find something. There must be something wrong with these sectors. There must be something wrong with the healthcare sector. There's plenty wrong, but there must be something wrong with the healthcare sector or the education sector or the repair sector. What's wrong with the repair sector that has made prices go up so much? And what I'm pointing out, which is due to Baumol, is no. Actually, the answer to why the prices in these sectors is so high is not something wrong with that sector. It's something right with all the other sectors. So you have to look outside the sector. So if you want to understand why repair has become, like repairing shoes, the service good, why has that become so much more expensive? It's because the person doing the repair could be doing these other much more productive things. And so it's the success of all the other sectors, the productive sectors, which drives up the price in the service sectors, in the low productivity service sectors. And again, the price is just a representation of the fact that we have to give up a lot of goods because we've gotten really productive at these people in these other sectors. They can produce a lot. We got to give up a lot of, chairs and CDs and books and, all his cars and all that stuff we're really good at, televisions. We got to give up a lot of that stuff, which is good stuff. We got to get a lot of that, give up a lot of that to get more massages and healthcare and education and so forth. So the better we are at other stuff, the more expensive the low productivity stuff becomes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the Baumol effect is a very, very good and fundamental truth about the world. Um, and it leads to this counterintuitive insight that, hey, if technology advances, it also improves the wages. It doesn't put people out of labor. It actually improves the wages of people in lower productivity sectors where technology can't raise the productivity that much, like a string quartet or music or culture. So that's a good thing, right? So that kind
Yes.
of distributes some of the gains from technology as
Yes.
opposed to, oh, AI is going to put people out of work and lower their salaries, right?
Right. Right. Absolutely. So you think about barbers. Again, uh, you could have a great haircut, in Roman era, 1 BC, or I often say, always get a haircut in a poor country, right? So when I go to India, I always get a haircut because I can get a haircut in India for like $1. And it's just as good. In fact, I get a head massage. To give you a great head massage as well. So, you get a better haircut for $1 in India than you do for $20 in the United States. Well, why is that? Well, it's actually the difference is because the worker in India, the barber in India, doesn't have a lot of other good opportunities. So to get more barbers in India, you're again pulling them from, you know, low productivity farming, from low productivity manufacturing, and so forth. While in the United States, to get a barber, you have to pull them from a high productivity manufacturing or high productivity food production and so forth. So the barber in the United States earns a lot more, not because they're a better barber than the one in India, because everybody else is better. Because as you just said, the barber in the United States gets the advantage of everyone else being high productivity in the United States because of the technology, because of the education, the human capital, the institutions. So all of those beneficial factors of the United States, they flow to the barber, even though the barber himself is not doing anything, you know, better than the one in India.
Yeah. But at the same time, as you mentioned before, that doesn't mean like all is good, that
Sure.
that's inevitable and, that's all good. That's education should increase that much or healthcare. That's also not the case, right? It's not that the Baumol effect is, it's just this analytical truth about the world, right? So, but it's, that's kind of my challenge that I would put forward. Cause, you want to just, you're kind of saying, oh, things like regulation or unions or whatever, they don't explain this big effect. And I think that's correct. But the Baumol effect is an analytical truth, right? So it's comparable to like accounting, right? You're saying what goes in here has to make way here, but
Yes.
it doesn't explain the different line items and why they're there and how you can cut costs, right? And to
Right.
me, it seems at the same time it could still be true that there is something wrong in these sectors, right?
Oh, sure. So there's a couple of points to be made there, and that is that one, the Baumol effect explains these long run differences. So the price of education has been going up for over 100 years. Price of medical care, well over 100 years. People in 1900 were complaining about how much more expensive it was to, go see the doctor than it used to, right? So the Baumol effect explains that change in relative prices over this long run. Or similarly, essentially, it's the same idea explaining why uh, barbers in the United States earn more than barbers in India. Okay, this big relative price. Now, lots of things, of course, are wrong with the healthcare sector and with the education sector. So it's easy to also point to regulatory problems. But I don't think those regulatory problems, they don't explain this. They're problems. We have to fix them, but they don't explain this long run, this very big macro effect. Because after all, we have been, how healthcare has been regulated in all kinds of different ways over the last 100 years, and this sort of increase in the relative price of healthcare happens year after year after year after year. It's a very long run, slow but long run process, and it also doesn't explain, like again, why education is so much cheaper in India again than in the United States. So this Baumol effect explains these long run things. But that doesn't mean that we would like to improve the productivity if we could of services. That would be fantastic. Maybe robots will start to do that. And it also doesn't say that there aren't any problems to be fixed. I would say, however, people are a little bit too quick to assume that this problem is. So if you want to say that the reason why prices in healthcare have been going up in a relative way, if you want to say that's due to regulation, then you have to say that regulation is growing in healthcare more than it's growing in other fields. And I'm not even sure that that is true, right? So if you'd looked at like regulation, go talk to somebody in the auto industry where productivity has improved tremendously, and you ask them, has regulation, gone up in your industry? And they go, oh my God, yes. It used to be so much easier to make a car. Now there are all these safety problems, and we have to design the car to these specifications, and we can't do this in the engine and the environment, and we have all these environmental regulations, and they would tell you there's been a huge amount of regulation of automobiles. So it's not even obvious, although there's lots of regulation of healthcare and there are problems. It's not even obvious that it's so much more than in sectors where the productivity has been going way up.
Yeah, let me challenge it a bit further because I do think that I saw some problems when I read the paper that contradict some of my, maybe I have a bias there. So first, to state my two biases. One, I'm generally a bit more skeptical about macro, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's because I worked in measurement, right? And in data analytics. So I did hundreds of data collection projects with public and private sector, academia, everything. And it was just very, I think few people realize how bad the data is that we often work with, even the one that is extremely widely used by everyone,
Right, right.
how many limitations and caveats there are and how easy it is to misinterpret. But even the most basic things, even sometimes the biggest experts get wrong, right? Especially when it comes to techniques of measuring certain numbers. I think even academics are not trained in, what's the difference if we ask the question this way or that way, right? They're very well trained in putting analytical models using that data, right? So that's why I'm very skeptical of macro in general, because very few people pay attention to sort of the garbage in, garbage out problem.
Yeah.
Right. This is why I'm also, when you say, we would need to see this growth in regulation to explain this macro phenomenon, I'm a bit like, is regulation like a linear phenomenon, right?
Right.
Because, you can have tons of regulations that are fine or don't do a lot of damage, but then you can have one that can have like this outsized impact, right? And the other bias is I work in technology. So it seems to me from my vantage point that technology is massively outpacing the rest of the economy. It's almost a miracle. And without it, I think we wouldn't make much growth or progress even, right? So
Yes.
I always have this difference sort of new startups and how quick and agile and fast they are and how sort of capable these entrepreneurs are versus kind of the rest of the economy, big firms with a lot of bloated bureaucracy. So to me, kind of the creative destruction explanation kind of makes a lot of sense, right? So if there's an open process, a lot of creative destruction can take place. And the entrepreneurs that I work with every day, they can fix things, right? When there's regulation in place, they can fix things. And you can pretty systematically look at like healthcare. All right. So you need to invest like 10 years and invest hundreds of millions to bring a drug to the market. That sort of systematically forces you into a compliance mindset, right? You kind of need to start with lawyers. You need to start with people that can do the regulatory strategy with 20 years of experience that automatically sorts out the renegades and the misfits, the ones who come with ideas how to really deeply and fundamentally change things more, right? So I do think there is a much bigger role for the regulatory side than your paper is suggesting. And some of much of my own work is suggesting on the FDA and other things.
Sure. No, I totally agree with that. It's hard to disagree with that. Yeah, I think it is true that you see these big jumps in productivity, often in new fields where the government is just so behind that, they haven't caught up. So like Uber, just jumped ahead because it took the government a long time to figure out, how to regulate them. And the whole Silicon Valley and changes in software and crypto, all of these things, the government takes time, is slow, is coming behind. And so that gives you kind of a gives the entrepreneurs a time to jump ahead. Yeah. And look, the healthcare sector is so screwed up that, every theory about why it's screwed up is true because it's screwed up in every possible way. And so what I would say is that it's the Baumol effect just explains this very long run, change in relative prices so that we could fix everything in the healthcare system and make it, super innovative and so forth. And I think that would be fantastic. I want to do that. Um, I think what would happen is we would lower the price, okay, which would be great. We create a whole bunch of advances, increases in life expectancy, all that kind of good stuff, right? But then I think the trend would start, continue in the same direction until we solve this fundamental problem of how to increase, productivity in this high service sector, which again, it's not impossible. Robots, might be one way it would doing it.
Especially in
I've talked
education,
about,
right?
yeah,
There's so
education,
much of
online education, right? Is something I've talked a lot about. Uh, One teacher used to be able to reach, 30 students at a time. And now they can easily reach, 3,000, 300,000 students at a time. So that is a way in which we can increase the productivity of education. So yeah, I want to kind of box what the Baumol effect explains, um, and
right.
not
But
disagree
these
with
like
you.
two explanation kind of can go together. I don't need
Yeah,
to like quit my work and say everything I
no.
said to my audience is wrong. These regulations don't do anything. It's fine. It's just a bubble effect. Let's continue working.
Yeah, yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. I feel reassured now.
There are many problems to work on. And,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
But still, just to ponder quickly on that point, because, that's just one data point that I think is important just to understand the general trend, because it seems to me that it's not getting better when it comes to regulations, right? Instead, there's regulations are just piling on top of each other. And it's not this necessarily linear phenomenon. For a time, it might even get better. But over
Mhm,
time, it
mhm,
seems to me getting worse, right? And there was this one measure on regulation that you put in that uses kind of a more brute force linear approach. So how often are like specific restrictions included, like must or is required to? And that seems to me kind of a bit missing the point, right? Because, I don't think you're going to catch like the big NEPA regulations or like specific FDA regulations that require efficacy trials, right? So that's,
yeah. Yeah, no, you're right. So the paper you're talking about is one where, we use this measure of regulation from, based on reg data. And it sort of counts the number of regulatory words, in uh, in the corpus of federal, regulation. Um, And yeah, so it could be, you're right, that might not get at everything if there are a few particular laws which are especially bad, right? I mean, I think that's true. Uh, that itself, though, I think is also if that is if that is true, that's a good finding of the paper, right? Because that's not what people thought before, right? So, we find that the number of words, is maybe, if that's not the right measure of regulation, then, we need to go back and try and find out what it is. Because if it is just a few of these laws, which have these very, very big effects, well, that is very positive, right? That just means we just need to fix a few things, NEPA, and a few things like that, maybe some zoning or something of that nature.
yeah,
Yeah. So that's also an important thing to learn.
yeah.
So it's
And
testable. Let's try and find out if that's true or not.
yeah, yeah. Good. So, that's very reassuring to me. But in any case, so when I prepared for this podcast, I noted there's this one book that sounds really amazing, and that to my shame I haven't read yet, even though it's very topical for what I'm wanting to do. So please excuse my bad preparation. But can you talk a bit about your book for entrepreneurial economics? Right.
Oh yeah.
Especially, I'm interested. You have something that you can share with listeners that are kind of at the intersection of where or working in generally in regulated industries that is specific or that they can use in their work.
Right. So that book, Bright Ideas from the Dismal Science, Entrepreneurial Economics, Bright Ideas from the Dismal Science. That was a collection of what I thought were super clever papers using economics in unusual ways to suggest these changes in social institutions which can improve things. So that book came out a number of years ago, but I like one of them was Robin Hance's idea of prediction markets. So I was one of the first people to
I had him on
say,
in
"Hey,
episode three.
this is
Yeah.
great. Let's push this. Let's push prediction markets." So that was one of them. Another one, which is in the paper, is Michael Kremer's idea. He's since won the Nobel Prize. I'm very happy about that. I got a chance to work with him in the COVID years, so I'm very pleased about that. But the paper, which is in entrepreneurial economics, was his paper on what are called patent buyouts. And this was sort of an early prize like advanced market commitment paper. And the basic idea was we know that there's an argument for patents um, when the innovation costs are really high and imitation costs are low. So the first pill costs $1 billion, the second pill costs 50 cents, right? And once you know the formula, then anyone could come in and start producing the 50-cent pill. And then what happens to the guy who spent $1 billion to produce the formula? Well, he goes out of business, and if that happens, you don't get the drug in the first place. So that's the argument for patents. The problem is that, well, then you're selling the drug at a very high price. The cost is really low. So there's a dead weight loss because people are willing to pay more than the cost, but they're not able or willing to pay more than the price. So that's a loss, a social loss. So Michael Kremer's idea was that we ought to have these patent buyouts so that the government or maybe a big nonprofit would buy the patent from the owner of the patent and would then would then open it up to so that anyone could compete. And the advantage of this is that since the patent holder gets paid, they still have all the same incentives to innovate and research and develop the drug. But now we get competition coming in and the drug is priced, in marginal low cost. So often when we're talking about the high prices of pharmaceuticals, people say, well, we ought to have price controls like they do in Canada or Europe, or, we have to do something like that. But that introduces this trade-off, right? Is that if we, which I think is a terrible trade-off, is that if we don't allow the pharmaceutical companies to recoup a big portion of the R&D, then we're going to get fewer new drugs in the future. And these new drugs are incredibly valuable. They're much more valuable than their price. It's a really good deal. Pharmaceuticals, the social return to them is very high. But under Michael Kremer's idea, we don't face this trade-off because we still get innovation. In fact, we could pay extra, and then increase innovation even more, but we get the benefits of marginal cost pricing. So that was another idea which I sort of promoted in entrepreneurial economics.
I definitely got to read that. I do find as an entrepreneur that is really useful to use some of these economics, right? When it comes to auctions, for example, I have a good friend who has a company that's entirely based around that idea and how it can more accurately price certain things. If you experiment it as an auction with you have to bid, or prediction markets, I think are a very good tool, even though we haven't yet figured out how to use it at a broader scale. Later, would like to talk a bit more about dominance insurance contracts. Insurance general is a very economics heavy area. Did you write anything about insurance in general in that book?
Let's see. Can't, I don't think there's anything in insurance, but I agree with you. Insurance is a pretty, is a very useful idea. It was insurance, which allowed people to, take the voyages of, Vasco da Gama and all that kind of stuff. East India Company to go to India, pluses and minuses, but whatever. Um, because each of these trips was incredibly risky. And so if you just send one ship, that you might lose everything. You might come back super rich, but you might lose everything. So the the voyages of discovery were uh, as much or partially a result of innovations in finance than they were about, uh, figuring out that the world was round. We also had to figure out how can we insure these things. And the joint stock company, East India Company, was a joint stock company, one of the very first joint stock companies. So the innovations in finance and economics and insurance, in corporations, these were also very important to generate these voyages of discovery. But if we want to go to the moon, if we want to go to Mars, we also need to think about innovative funding mechanisms. So like crowdfunding and all of these new ideas which are coming out, I think we shouldn't overlook the uh, innovations in finance as an important precursor for innovations elsewhere in the economy.
Oh, absolutely. That's something I could riff on for much longer.
Yes, I'm sure.
Yeah. But insurance is also this very regulated industry. I don't
Hmm. Hmm.
yet know that much about it, to be honest, but I have this nagging feeling that it's one of the most low hanging fruits. But, it's pricing and risk, right? But there's all these barriers, like Robin Hansen said on the podcast, that insurance wasn't allowed by the Commodities and Futures Exchange Commission until like the, early 20th century or something, because it was considered gambling.
Right, right. Yeah,
So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and in
there's,
fact, it was also a marketing change because when we talk about life insurance, actually, obviously, it's not life insurance; it's death insurance, right? But it never sold under death insurance, right? People don't even want to think about, this is because that's what you're insuring. You get money when you die, right? But it didn't sell very well under death insurance. Only when you change the terminology to life insurance and I'm insuring the people who my loved ones. Then it began to take off. So there was a marketing change there as well.
mhm. Yeah. So can you talk a bit about your work on voluntary or private cities? Because that's something that my audience cares a lot about. I'm based in one in Prospera. We had people on from the Qatar Digital Economic Zone that you're an advisor to.
Yes.
So you've been influential in that space. What's your work? What are your insights into that space?
Right.
And I'm especially curious, why are they important? What is their track record so far? And what is their potential?
Yeah. Okay. So I guess the big picture that I would say is that we need more experiments in governance. Okay. So, um, we have these big nation states, and it's hard to experiment with new nation states. And it can be, painful. You have revolutions, right? Nobody really wants to go through that. Too much experimentation in these big things is like the French Revolution, people lose their heads, right? So you don't want too much of that. And also you get these monopolies, right? So you have these nation states and they get monopoly powers. And so we don't get very much experimentation. So I'm a huge admirer of the US Constitution and of the founding fathers, the founding fathers and Madison and Jefferson and so forth, Hamilton. These were great political insights. These were political economists of the highest order. And they designed a constitution. It's a brilliant document. But look, this is, 250 years old. And so it doesn't seem crazy to me to think that we ought to be having, experiments in governance. Um, so how can we do that somewhere between the micro and the nation state, the macro? And voluntary cities, I think, are probably the best alternative, the best level that we have. And because a lot goes on in cities, right? Cities are really the engines of the economies. More and more we are living, the urbanization. We are reaching the peak. We're not there yet, but the world has become much more urbanized, and a huge amount of activity, economic activity, uh, hold under the umbrella of the city. It's small enough so that we can have lots of different experiments without people losing their head, right? But it's large enough that i- the differences can be huge. And of course, the classic case here is with Hong Kong and Shenzhen, right? So this is what Deng Xiaoping said. He said, "Look, we need some experiments in governance in our communist country. I don't want to, risk the whole country, but what I'm going to do, I'm going to have 10 states, 10 cities, and we're going to give them some leeway in choosing the rules." And Shenzhen, being next to Hong Kong, said, "Hey, let's do something a little bit more like Hong Kong." And so Shenzhen became a tremendous, tremendous success story. And then you learn from that. So then Shenzhen was scaled, basically to the rest of China, right? So I think a city is um, a good level at which to have these experiments. You could experiment with, different types of economic systems, different types of policing, different types of construction and land regulation, taxation systems. All of these are important at the city level, and we need experimentation in all of them. Uh, so I think that this is this is our big hope for going forward. In fact, I don't know if you saw, but today actually it's a little bit I don't know. Well, I guess we'll come back to this, but Trump for his reelection campaign is promoting freedom cities. Okay,
Is he
and
really?
it came out today or yesterday. Yeah, it's quite interesting. And so what he wants to do is on federal land create these new opportunities to build, futuristic new cities. And there's a huge amount of federal land in the United States. You know, um, West of the Mississippi, it's like 50% in some states, more than 50%, like in Nevada, is federally owned land, and it's not parks. Okay, it's don't worry about the parks. We can still have plenty of parks, but there's huge amount of federally owned land, which is not being put to very high productive uses. So this, I think, actually is a good idea. I'm not a huge fan of Trump. He did some good things, he did some bad things, but Freedom Cities, I think, is actually a good idea of Trump's. I'm
Wow,
pretty,
I had no idea. He must have had
yeah,
a good advisor.
yeah,
Someone who's,
exactly. So I think he maybe, maybe he's learned from Prospera, and
yeah, he's,
yeah. So we'll
yeah.
see.
Yeah, or also Native American land, right? So you're an advisor
Yes,
to the Catawba Digital Economic Zone, which has digital business domicile. So if you're working in crypto and Web3, you can use that with a more clear set of regulations. So you're kind of don't have to be afraid of other federal regulators and what capricious things they might come up with.
yes, exactly. So the Native Americans, have been frankly, screwed out of their land for a long time, but they are federally recognized as sovereign countries. Maybe not quite as sovereign as a country, but they are recognized as sovereign entities. So there is an opportunity here within the United States to create a relatively free and innovative regulatory system. Still, the US has authority over US citizens, but like a state, the um, the Indian reservations, these Indian districts, can create, as you said, a more innovative and responsive system, particularly for something like Web3 crypto. So I'm kind of excited to be part of that. Um, and that was another thing which is in the book, actually, not crypto, but competitive federalism. So one of the ways in which the United States has been benefited is that we have not just different regulatory systems through the 50 states, but actually in some areas, competitive systems. So any corporation can choose which state to be regulated under, and then those laws apply to that corporation, right? So not just within the state in which it is regulated, but within the United States. So we have in the United States a competitive system of corporate regulation. And that has led to really innovative regulatory systems. Delaware being the most famous. So Delaware has specialized courts where the judges actually understand business. Okay. And so businesses like to be incorporated in Delaware because they know that the judges there are responsive and understand business conditions. Wyoming has instituted kind of the first recognition of blockchains. And as you pointed out, the Catawba Indian District, which I'm an advisor to, is looking to create more innovative and responsive regulatory systems for stable coins, for blockchains, for DAOs, these decentralized autonomous organizations, and so forth. So this competitive federalism in the United States, I think, is quite powerful.
Yeah, it's quite powerful. Um, so that's interesting to hear that cities have potential in the United States again. What have you learned from Gurgaon, India?
Yeah. Okay. So um, Gurgaon in India is a city which is just outside Delhi. And it's one of these amazing, like it's one of these cities in China, which was, 40 years ago, 1990s and 1980s, was basically just farmland. Okay. And then suddenly um, sprung up in Gurgaon, a private city. There's a very large owner and basically uh, became the hub for corporations who wanted to move to India. They wanted to get a base in India, and they were looking for a place where they would have a stable regulation under a entity which understood business. So we had essentially one large owner, like a private city. Gurgaon was essentially a private city, private police force, private fire services, private roads. Okay, and incredibly successful. So amazing skyscrapers and, glass buildings and golf courses and a lot of business. A lot of businesses, in fact, did move there. So it's become one of the most popular places, one of the best places in India to live for somebody in the rising, managerial class. And overall, it's run, quite well, certainly better than most Indian cities. So the private city model worked really quite well. Not, however, perfectly. Not, however, perfectly. And so my co-author, Shruti Rajagopalan, and I investigated, and there were a set of problems which were essentially in these very large public goods, to produce these very large public goods. The main ones being like sewage and electricity. Okay. And what happened is we didn't have although it started out as a, single private owner, um, we didn't have enough of an encompassing owner to really handle these two big encompassing issues, sewage and electricity. What do I mean? Well, to have a sewage system, you've got to connect everything. It makes sense to connect everything and then put it to a sewage plant. Okay. So what was needed was a set of agreements among all of the skyscraper owners and so forth that we're going to connect to a sewage plant. And that really didn't happen. So kind of remarkably, what happens now is the sewage from these skyscrapers is collected in trucks and it's trucked off and, sometimes dumped. We don't want to talk about where it goes. And same thing with electricity. So if you wanted to take advantage of economies of scale, you wanted a big electrical plant, and then it's delivered, to all of these different owners in the city. And they weren't able to get together. The transactions costs were too high to enable them to do that. So what happens again is we have these skyscrapers, but often they're run by a diesel generator, high polluting, not very efficient. Okay. So on the surface, everything looks very modern, like we would have in the United States, Australia, New Zealand, or something like that. But underneath the surface, things don't work quite the way you would expect. You have sewage with trucks and diesel generators instead of a nuclear power plant, which is 50 miles away and delivers the electricity. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So no, continue.
Well, so the bottom line is that um, you really do need a very large or a large piece of land to be owned by the same entity and to keep ownership in order to produce these public goods. So I think that Gurgaon shows you both the success of a private city. Private police force, private fire department works very well, but they were not able to produce these large citywide public goods. So I'm hoping that it is possible to do that. There's other cities in India. Jamshedpur is a steel city put together by Tata, many years ago, and it works very well, very well. It's large enough to be able to do some of this. Company town, steel town. But I'm hoping Prospera and some of these other experiments in charter cities keep in mind that you really do need a city is a dance between the bottom up and the top down. And the bottom up is fantastic, okay? But there are some issues where this bottom up development is it has difficulty handling citywide public goods like sewage and electricity. So you need some top down, maybe some planning. Okay, here's where the roads are going to be. Okay, so kind of you reserve some areas, and then you let private development within that grid structure, within that structure, take place. Here we're going to produce the electricity. Here we're going to produce the sewage, and you're all going to be connected. Now go out, and we're not going to tell you what to produce. That's bottom up behavior. So it really is this dance between the top down and the bottom up, and you need to get both sets right to take advantage of the benefits of both.
Yeah, that's a fascinating learning. And I like the metaphor of a dance between bottom up and top down. Same time, also wondering, like when it comes to electricity, can't you have that more like microgrid or small scale nuclear power or something like that? So it's really a technology input that's necessary to have things kind of more decentralized and more bottom up, right?
Yeah. So to the extent that you, yes, technology sometimes creates big economies of scale and and sometimes it creates decentralization, right? But you can't always count on a technology to be decentralized, right? So, through much of the 20th century, the cheapest way by far to generate electricity was to have a very centralized, set of dams, the Hoover Dam, you know, and these nuclear power plants or coal plants and, things like that, which is a centralized process with a grid. And that was by far the cheapest way to do that. The decentralized approach was much more expensive, much more expensive. Now, sometimes, okay, technology changes over time, and sometimes it's even directed technological change, and a decentralized approach became possible at a cheap enough rate that it's able to overcome the centralized approach. We can hope for that, but it may take a very long time, and I think you can't always count on that. So you do have to do the dance. You do have to do the dance. Not everything could be decentralized.
Yeah, that's a super important insight for any new city developer. And also, if I may do my own summary or put a bit of a model on it, right? Because sometimes you do have these ready-made solutions, like we know how to do sewage and electricity centrally, right? So there's a case to be made. You should do it top down, as you just said. But the problem that you create with sort of these top-down provided public goods is that you're locked into it,
Yep.
right? Because once you have it, it's very hard to change it after. So maybe the technology changes and there's more decentralized solutions that are more adaptive to change, right? Or, but you kind of have to take that risk. Maybe you're stuck with a bad solution for a long time until you get the technology to fix it. I'd much sympathize with erring on the side of decentralization because it leaves the process open again for creative destruction, rather than sort of having top-down solutions. But yeah, it's a dance, right? Because who wants to come to a city with a bad switch system? That's
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, it's a fascinating insight. Another one is, or what I love to talk about is what I haven't seen discussed much, both in the sort of private cities community and when it comes to public goods funding, but also people in the Web3 space care a lot about public goods funding in the crypto space, right? So
Yeah.
you're building different goods on top. It's easier to tokenize things, so things are more liquid. So starting kind of to think about bottom-up solutions as well to fund these public goods. So can you talk about funding public goods and about dominant assurance contracts?
Sure. Yeah. So, the one way of thinking about, Web3 and crypto and so forth is that they want to replace these, centralized, private, but centralized, institutions, whether it be Facebook or Uber or something like that, with a protocol to get rid of platforms, okay, as a competitor to platforms, which is a company, right? And a company brings together, Uber brings together the drivers and the customers, the people who want to travel. Airbnb brings together, the home sellers, the home owners, and people who want to travel and so forth. So these platforms, okay, now platforms are great, but you are turning over, as you know, a huge amount of power over to a centralized authority. So, which is it could be worrying, right? So, like Uber, you think about a taxi system. I love Uber. Don't get me wrong. I think Uber is fantastic. It's a great innovation. I use it all the time. It's super convenient. It's fantastic. Okay, but there is something which is worrying: is that no one could stop me from using a taxi, right? And certainly no one could stop me from using a taxi like anywhere in the world, right? So, if I'm in Mumbai, I could hail a taxi. If I'm in New York, I could hail a taxi. No one could stop me, right? Okay. But if Uber suddenly decides we don't like Alex Tabarrok, we don't like his political views, they just have to write, one line of code, Alex Tabarrok zeroed out. We're not taking his credit card. And I'm screwed. I can no longer access driving services in New York or in Mumbai, anywhere in the world, right? Because Uber is so prevalent, and there's not a lot of alternatives, right? Lyft and things like that. But
But that I'm a bit skeptical about, right? Because
yeah,
as we know, sort of these natural monopolies are very hard to form in a competitive market, right?
hmm
So
hmm
if Uber really goes, it makes really bad decisions as to excluding like famed economists.
yes.
And I'm sure there's going to be like a taxi service that specializes in famed economists, right?
I'm not so sure. Maybe, but let's put aside how real it. Well, let me change it. Let me change my scenario slightly. If the government says to Uber, "We don't like
Hmm.
Alex Tabarrok, shut him down," well, then there's no competitor, right? And so it's possible, and the Chinese government obviously is doing things exactly like that,
But then
right?
the risk is not like Uber and these technology platforms. It's a quibble that I have with many people with through or Facebook or whatever. The problem is what the government does with it. That's the risk, right?
Well, yeah,
And that
yes, but
virtually applies to any technology, right?
no. I don't think it does apply to any technology
True.
because
Yeah. Censorship resistant and yeah.
right, right. I mean, the platform provides the technology in which you can write somebody out with a database, a link. So
Mhm.
going back, so what is Web3 all about? Web3 is changing platforms into protocols. Okay, so to say we're going to use a protocol like the email protocol, which anybody can access and anybody can then use, right? And so the hope and the dream is to create open protocols which are, as you had pointed out, with these decentralized, you have new technologies, new ideas, new ways of doing, like the internet itself, right? So there's nobody in control of the internet. Anybody can put up a web page. So we might be able to create a protocol for drivers and people who want lifts, which anybody could access. Lots of different companies could access that same protocol, or a protocol for, connecting people who have homes to rent with people who want to rent a house. Anybody could connect with these protocols, or a Facebook protocol, a Twitter protocol, um, a money protocol. So that's the idea. But the problem, as you had pointed out, is that how then does the protocol evolve over time? Okay. Um, Nobody owns it. So that means there's not as large an incentive to improve the protocol, because if you make an improvement, well, anyone can access that improvement. So there's a free rider problem. Nobody wants to pay to improve the protocol. There's that cartoon where you have these protocols, and it's sort of building on brick and brick and brick and brick, brick, brick. And the whole thing is founded upon this one guy in Iowa who is maintaining the public code. Right? And that's kind of a problem. So one thing which the Web3 protocols have had to try and deal with is, how can we create public goods? Okay. How can we create a system where the protocol can be updated and improved over time, even though it's open to everybody? Okay. Who is going to improve something which can't be captured, where the gains can't be captured? So some ways of doing that, create a coin, and then a bunch of the coin is allocated to a foundation. And you hope the foundation, like an Isaac Asimov's foundation, will last for a long time and will spend the money wisely. That of course obviously has problems, like, the Ford Foundation, became controlled by, lefties, right? And started out doing some good stuff, and then, declines over time because the original founders are gone, and then you have rent seeking, and people climb to the top, and there's a pool of money, and they grab hold of the foundation. So
Whose law was it that over time any organization tends to become more left wing?
yeah, Conquest. I think that's Robert
Yeah.
Conquest's law. No, that's exactly right. Um, so so there's lots of experiments in trying to create methods to produce public goods. Okay. Um, one of my earliest papers, which was like pre crypto, pre Web3, was creating these dominant assurance contracts. That's what I called them at the time, because it was an assurance contract, much like Kickstarter. This is before Kickstarter, but in Kickstarter, you have what's called an assurance contract, which means that you give money to fund, some public good, or some new device, but they only take the money if enough funds have been raised to actually complete the project successfully. That's the idea. So you are assured that your money won't be used unless the whole package will be successful, right? Okay, that's an assurance contract. A dominant assurance contract, but the problem with
Kickstarter, right?
Kickstarter exactly is
Mhm.
an assurance contract. A dominant assurance contract is an improvement on this, because the assurance contract, you might say, okay, well, let's say I say I'm not going to give. Okay. Well, if you know that I'm not going to give, it's an equilibrium for you not to give as well. Okay. So the assurance contract has multiple equilibria, and some of those equilibria lots of them involve non-funding. So most Kickstarters fail. 70% of them fail. Right. The dominant assurance contract changes this. And the way it works is pretty simple. Another term for it is called refund bonuses. Okay. And the idea is very, very simple. It's that if the contract fails, so if we don't reach the threshold, then every person who agreed to donate, not only are they given their money back, but they're given back a refund bonus. Okay. Now let's go back to the situation where I'm not going to contribute. I say, I'm not going to contribute to this. Well, now you're going to say, hey, I want to contribute because I think this thing is not going to work, but then that means I'm going to get the refund bonus. So now you want to contribute. And of course, the logic is the same for me. So now there is no equilibria under which the contract fails. Okay. Because if I think you're not going to contribute, I do want to contribute. So there's always an incentive to contribute. And if I think that you're going to contribute, well, I still want to contribute because then I want to at least get the public good produced, assuming that the public good has value. We do have to assume that the ultimate thing this thing is going to create is worth something. If it's not worth something, then of course the contract may fail. But if the public good is worth producing, then this dominant assurance contract or these refund bonuses can make that happen. So I wrote that paper many years ago, and then the crypto guys kind of got interested in it, and so that got it a little more attention than it originally had. And then more recently, some colleagues, Tim Kaysen and Robertus Zebrickas, have been, along with myself, I've been writing some papers testing this contract experimentally in the lab. And we find, in fact, it does work. I mean, it doesn't work perfectly, nothing works perfectly, but it doubles the success rate. So if you have a bunch of projects, which are decent projects, this will double the potential for success. And that's enough so that sometimes the contract will fail and then the entrepreneur will have to pay out these refund bonuses, right? But since the contract doubles the number of successes, the profits on the successes are enough to pay for the refund bonuses on the failures. The refund bonuses don't even have to be that large. They just have to be enough to get people's attention. So this contract is a profitable way of producing public goods.
Excellent. How big should the markup for the refunds?
Yeah, so it's going to depend upon the context. It could be like one way of thinking about it, like 5% of your donation. That might be a way of doing it. It could be different circumstances. It could be like $10 or $50. It's going to depend upon the situation. It's just enough so that people say, oh, there's a chance for me to make some money here if the contract fails. That's worthwhile doing, right? So just enough to get people's attention. Then it can work.
Yeah, I can't believe it's not used more widely because it's such a neat concept.
Me neither.
Yeah.
But I take some hope in when I published the entrepreneurial economics book. As I mentioned, like Robin Hanson's prediction markets, no one had heard of it then at all, right? And today, they're not used as widely as I think they should be used, but lots of people know about the Hollywood Stock Exchange. Lots of people know that if you want to predict the outcome of the next election, you go to the Iowa political markets. They're all these betting markets. So lots of people understand now that if you want to predict the outcome of an election, Clinton versus Trump, then look at the market prices. So prediction markets, I think, have become much better known. They still should be used more often, and maybe refund bonuses or dominant assurance contracts, maybe it will become more known in the future as well. Hopefully while I'm still alive.
Yeah. I didn't know about this concept until like a couple of days ago, which makes me wonder how much more is there that you, GMU, the econ professors have come up with. But anyway, so the reason I found out about it is, so I have to give a shout out here to Joseph McKinney from the Qatar Zone, actually. And he asked me to ask a question, how it could apply to digital jurisdictions like his. Actually, just gave me an idea what it could be interesting for is my industry, VC and fundraising, right? So startups are often facing sort of the skepticism by early investors. Are they really going to be able to raise? No one wants to invest in a company that isn't able to successfully raise a big round, right? Same in a VC fund, sort of investors in my fund, sort of the early investors are sort of the biggest hurdle to get over, right? So kind of having this as a mechanism for assurance for early investors that could be really, really useful, but not sure which specific regulations would be preventing this, but I'm pretty sure there are other regulations that are
Right.
preventing this because VC funding and startup funding is very regulated. There's regulations when it comes to
Yes.
crowdfunding. There's all these, oh, you can't provide these brokerage services and you can't do general solicitation and this and that. So maybe that could be a good case that in the Qatar war zone, we could write kind of laws that make it easier to do these crowdfunding or crowdfinancing mechanisms that could allow dominant assurance contracts.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. There's another advantage of these refund bonuses, which my colleagues and I are working on now, actually, and that is that the signal quality. Because if you have an entrepreneur who has a good project, they're much more willing to offer the refund bonuses than an entrepreneur who has a bad project. Because if they have a bad project, then it's more likely to fail and the entrepreneur will have to pay out the refund bonuses. Well, if the project is good, the entrepreneur, like a warranty, can feel free to offer a really good warranty because they know it's not going to be used because the product is high quality. So if they know that their a product is high quality, they can offer refund bonuses because they're not going to have to pay them. So we've been working on an experimental paper showing this as well. So yeah, I agree. It's a part of decentralized finance, can help to overcome the asymmetric information problem when when the project entrepreneur knows more about the quality than do the investors. Refund bonuses can be a good signal of that this is a high quality project and convey that information in a credible way to the investors.
Yeah. Increases a bit the risk for entrepreneurs though, especially so if you're like a first time entrepreneur or don't have like much money to back it up,
Right.
that probably not going to help you, but you and I don't have a problem with unlimited upside, right? So,
Right.
you know,
So, yeah, so there is some risk though. Of course, entrepreneurs face all kinds of risks,
they
right?
face the risk anyway. They face the
they,
risk right
they
now,
face
right?
huge risk anyway.
Yes, it
Uh,
makes it a bit easier for sort of experienced entrepreneurs, but it doesn't make it worse for the first time entrepreneur, right? If anything, it
yeah,
could even make it better. It provides an additional option.
exactly. I think if you look at the system overall, this is a way of reducing risk because you're reducing some of this asymmetric information risk. You're reducing some of the funding risk. You're making it more likely to get investors and so forth. Though it does require um, some more upfront capital, but of course, so does the whole project, right? So, people have to give up something. There's always risks. So this is another, it's like getting it's like moving to San Francisco, to moving to Silicon Valley, and renting, a place of business, right? It's expensive, right? That's a risk. Um, it's very, very expensive, but it helps to be in the Bay Area, to raise venture capital. So this is another way in which it's going to help you to raise capital. But of course, there are some expenses as well, but that is true of everything in entrepreneurship.
Yeah. So is there anything else that we haven't talked about yet that could be useful or aren't yet used enough, or especially in the context of like entrepreneurs and private cities?
Yeah. So I think one thing to think about in the context of entrepreneurs and private cities is you've got to align incentives. Very, very important because especially if we're thinking about these charter cities like Prospera, things of that nature, how are you going to get the government to go along with the charter city? So I think the the owners of the charter city have to think a lot about aligning the incentives of the elites and aligning the incentives of the government. And this is where you might want to create, shares in the private city, maybe based upon a land tax. Okay. And some of those shares should be allocated to the government, or the government should, get tax revenues on an ongoing basis. Right. So it's really, really important to align the incentives. You want to always make it that the local government which you need to get buy-in from, okay, um, that they have a greater incentive to see the charter city be successful and ongoing than to expropriate it tomorrow, right? And so you want to get them um, involved in getting long-run incentives, and that could come out of tax revenues from the charter city. And a nice way of doing that is to have a land tax so that the more public goods are created, the Henry George kind of theorem, the more public goods are created, the greater the value of the land, which you can then recoup from a land tax. So a land tax gives the owners of the charter city an incentive to create public goods, like sewage, like electricity, like the rule of law, like a good court system, like a good police system, because that means that people want to live there, people want to work there. That raises the value of the land. And then that value of the land is recouped in a tax to pay for the public goods. And then the government gets a chunk of that, gets a share of that. So you don't always want to think about, the lesson here is that it's not simply laissez-faire, let us do whatever we want. You want to give them a cut of the action, okay, so that the incentives are aligned, so that everybody wants to create a long-run prosperous city, okay, and everyone's incentives are aligned. So just thinking about incentives is a big thing which economists do. Mechanism design, getting everybody on board. Should you pay people by the piece, or should you pay them a salary? Should you give prizes? When do you give bonuses? All these kinds of things, which exist between principals and agents, between employers and workers. You also want to think about them between the owners of the charter city and the government, which regulates them, and the workers and businesses which come to the charter city. You got to get all those incentives aligned.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think it also partly explains Prospero's success thus far, because it has a model like that where the where there's tax revenues shared with the Honduran government, and they did a very good job of including local workers that are employed. They bought land from owners that were there and involved them into the process. So I think that partly explains the success, and it's a very important lesson. I'll speak more about that with one of the Prospero founders, Gabriel Delgado, very soon.
Right. How's your sewage?
The sewage right now, I mean, we're piggybacking off of what was there before, right?
Yeah. Good.
So, and on the greenfield side, there's only this one building, right? So basically a co-working space. Yeah. How does the sewage system there work? I can ask Gabriel. But Alex, this was so fascinating. I mean, what's great about the space that I'm in, what makes me so excited is that we can try out these ideas from people such as yourself and your colleagues at George Mason University, from economists, mechanism design, some insurance contracts. I think we learned about that concept in this episode. That's something I'm very keen to bring to the attention of more people in the space that could solve some of the public goods problem that you raised. And we've been hearing from you that these public goods problems do arise. So I think this was a very, very insightful episode, and I think will be very positively received by my audience. So thanks so much, Alex, for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.